I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again with another edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at a true neglected masterpiece, Kathryn Bigelow's Strange Days, starring Ralph Fiennes, Angela Bassett, Tom Sizemore, Juliet Lewis, Vincent D'Onofrio, and loads more character actors who were active in the era. Co-written and produced by James Cameron, this was a hugely ambitious $42 million sci-fi epic that, unfortunately, derailed Bigelow's career for a solid decade before she came back in a massive way with The Hurt Locker. Flashback to Los Angeles in the 90s, and the city was on fire, much like the whole nation is right now, I'm sorry to say. This was the era of the Rodney King beating and riots, the O.J. Simpson trial and acquittal, and the drive-by shootings of Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur, all of which had a huge impact on Strange Days, despite the fact that Cameron had initially conceived of the premise, that being a crime thriller / love story set in the eve of the millennium back in the 80s. In hindsight, a $42 million thriller without any major stars or even huge action set pieces probably seems like an unlikely big studio movie, but keep this in mind. James Cameron was probably the hottest property in Hollywood at the time. Terminator 2 Judgment Day reinvented the modern action movie, and True Lies had printed money for Studio 20th Century Fox. Bigelow was no slouch either. Point Break, which also had some involvement by James Cameron, was a huge hit for the studio, turning Keanu Reeves into an action hero overnight. And $42 million, while expensive, probably seemed like a pretty safe bet. I mean, even if it didn't break even theatrically, there was always home video. And how bad could it do? I mean, it's a sci-fi action movie. Plus, stars Ralph Fiennes and Angela Bassett were both on the rise. They had just earned Oscar nominations, with Fiennes for Schindler's List and Bassett for What's Love Got to Do with It. What could possibly go wrong? Plenty. Whether it was a lack of star power or the fact that audiences were utterly disinterested in watching a movie with a very pessimistic view of the millennium, which was only 5 years away at the time, audiences stayed away in droves. It was basically dumped by the studio, only grossing $7.9 million total. A disaster. It would take a full 5 years before Bigelow got another movie out there, The Weight of Water, which, I'm sad to say, no one saw, including me. 3 years later came K-19 The Widowmaker, but again, despite Harrison Ford and Liam Neeson in the lead roles, it was another disaster. But things turned out just fine for Bigelow, who's now one of the most in-demand directors on the planet. Now, I was turned on to Strange Days by an old magazine called Sci-Fi Universe, which was how us geeks used to get our movie news before the internet really became widespread. Sure, the internet existed in 1995, but unless you had some serious coin and a lightning-fast 96K modem, magazines were all you had. I vividly remember reading an appreciation of this by one of the authors who called the film a neglected masterpiece, and when it hit VHS, I rented it with a friend, and we thought the movie was just great. For one thing, the premise had us hooked. In it, Fiennes plays a former cop named Lenny Nero, who's gotten his hands on Squib, a virtual reality recorder that plugs into your cerebral cortex and can record experiences that could then be sold to the highest bidder. If you want to know what it's like to rob a liquor store, you can do it. If you're a man who wants to experience sex as a woman, or vice versa, no problem. Lenny will sell anything except snuff tapes, meaning no rapes, no suicides, and no murders. He has a virtual monopoly on the trade and prowls the LA nightlife with his loyal bodyguard Mace, played by Angela Bassett, who is secretly in love with her boss due to his kindness to her young son back when he was a cop. Alas, Lenny is madly in love with Juliet Lewis's character, who's basically playing Courtney Love, in that she's a grunge singer tied up with a well-connected record producer played by the raspy-voiced Michael Wincott.
Tell you what, Lenny, just for you. How the fuck did you get up here? Faith always knows what she wants.
When Lenny gets his hands on a snuff tape involving a friend of his, he manages to uncover a conspiracy involving the LAPD's murder of a black activist / rapper, all the while the millennium is slowly creeping up while LA seems on the verge of burning down. It's hard to watch this movie now in some ways, as it feels quite forward-thinking and cutting edge, and how it's a very critical look at the police, with the only truly heroic characters being an ex-dirty cop played by Ralph Fiennes and his gun-toting bodyguard played by Angela Bassett. Now, Fiennes is terrific in what has to be an atypical part, but the real star of the show in some ways is Angela Bassett, who could have been a real contender as a female action star in the mold of Sigourney Weaver had this movie gone over better. She's clearly the heroic lead, while Fiennes' Nero is almost the damsel in distress, a unique take on the genre, especially for 1995. Visually, the film is a feast, with Matthew Leonetti's lensing distinct from Cameron's usual blue light thing, although his fingerprints do feel like they're on the film in some ways. That said, this is Bigelow's film through and through, with it showing off her growing social consciousness in a big way, which would later pay off in movies like Zero Dark 30 and Detroit, while maintaining the propulsive action aesthetic she showed off in Blue Steel, Point Break, and would later use in The Hurt Locker years later. It makes one wish that she'd do another action-driven movie. Plus, the score by Graham Revell is one of his best, with an excellent mid-90s techno song score by Deep Forest, with tracks by Peter Gabriel, Tricky, Lords of Acid, and more. Nowadays, Strange Days is a bit of a cult classic, but it's frustratingly hard to find. It's on DVD in a crummy non-anamorphic transfer, but that's about it. It's never been released domestically on Blu-ray, probably due to Cameron's interference, along with True Lies and The Abyss, which he's always said he'd restore, but he's totally missed the home video revolution because he's been busy with the Navi and Avatar. It's not even available digitally, although it was streaming for a while. That's too bad. Nevertheless, it's worth tracking down, especially if you have a region-free player. This is one great movie and worth rediscovery. I absolutely love it, and if anything, it's more relevant now than it was 25 years ago. For JOBLO.com, I'm Chris Bumbray.